It was just another night at Le Beau Séjour, the kind of upscale restaurant where I worked as a waitress. The place was always buzzing with chatter and the clink of fine crystal, with guests dressed to the nines, savoring dishes I could never afford. I had grown accustomed to the routine, balancing trays, pasting a polite smile on my face, and pretending that I didn't notice the dismissive looks from customers who saw me as little more than part of the background. But tonight everything changed. It all started with one careless mistake. An error that would set into motion events I could never have anticipated, as if fate had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I had been serving a table occupied by Mr. Antonov, a Russian billionaire whose name sent a ripple of dread through the entire staff whenever it appeared on the reservation list. He was notorious for his sharp tongue and impossible standards, the kind of customer who would scrutinize every detail with the meticulousness of a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. If the soup wasn't hot enough, if the sauce didn't have the right consistency, or if a garnish was misplaced, he would send the dish back with a dismissive wave of his hand and an icy glare that made the kitchen staff flinch. He was a regular at Le Beau Séjour, though not for the food or ambience. It seemed as if he enjoyed the power he wielded over the staff, relishing the chance to remind us that we were at his service. And he never, not once, left a tip. Tonight, his table was positioned near the center of the restaurant, beneath a glittering chandelier that cast a soft, golden glow over the white linen tablecloths and sparkling crystal. The low hum of classical music drifted from the speakers, mingling with the quiet conversations that filled the dining room. I could see Mr. Antonov seated in his usual spot, surrounded by a few guests, business associates, perhaps, dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening wear. His presence was unmistakable. Even seated, he commanded attention with his imposing frame and the air of authority that seemed to cling to him like an invisible cloak. A nervous energy hummed beneath the surface as I approached his table, vibrating through my veins. My grip tightened around the neck of the aged bottle of Bordeaux that I carried on the silver tray, its dark glass catching the light and reflecting it in deep, crimson hues. I had served him many times before, but there was always a certain pressure when it came to Mr. Antonov, an unspoken understanding that even the slightest misstep could earn you his scorn. I took a slow, steady breath, forcing a smile onto my face as I reached his table. I wish I could say what happened next was a blur, but I remember every moment in painful, crystal clear detail. It all began with a slight stumble, the kind that almost goes unnoticed, a subtle catch of my heel on the plush burgundy carpet, which was thick and luxurious beneath my feet, yet treacherous when it bunched up unexpectedly. I felt myself pitching forward, my arms flailing slightly as I struggled to regain balance, and that's when I saw it. The glass of wine perched precariously on the edge of my tray. Time seemed to slow as I watched it tip, the ruby liquid sloshing inside, its dark surface catching the glint of the chandelier above. The gasp that escaped my lips was barely audible, swallowed up by the murmur of the dining room, but it was too late. The glass slipped from my tray and struck the table with a dull thud, toppling over and releasing a flood of deep red wine. It cascaded across the pristine white tablecloth like spilled blood, its color stark and shocking against the immaculate fabric. For a moment, it seemed almost beautiful in its destruction, like the sudden, vivid bloom of a crimson flower. The wine raced outward in all directions, soaking into the cloth, spreading like an unforgiving stain that bled toward the edge of the table. It stopped just short of Mr. Antonov's tailored suit, a sleek charcoal gray with sharp lines that screamed of wealth and power. His hand, which had been resting on the table, twitched ever so slightly, and his gaze slowly lifted to meet mine. The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that sucks the air from your lungs and makes your skin prickle with tension. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes boring into me, a mix of curiosity, judgment, and thinly veiled amusement. But it was Mr. Antonov's eyes that held me captive, cold, pale blue, and now darkened with unmistakable fury. The corner of his mouth curled in disdain as he flicked a glance at the ruined tablecloth, then back at me. "You clumsy girl," he spat, his voice low and venomous, dripping with contempt. Each word was like the lash of a whip, deliberate and cutting. "Do you even know how much this tablecloth costs? Or are you too stupid to understand the value of anything in this place?" The shame rushed up to my cheeks, burning hotly beneath my skin. It was as if every eye in the room was a spotlight, searing me under its glare. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady even as it trembled with the humiliation I felt. "I'm so sorry, sir," I said, barely above a whisper. "It was an accident. I'll clean it up right away." The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but there was nothing else I could say. I kept my gaze lowered, focusing on the spreading stain, trying to block out the smirk I could sense forming on his lips and the whispered snickers from the nearby tables. The moment's weight hung over me like a thick fog, suffocating and impossible to escape. But he wasn't interested in apologies. He wanted retribution. His lips curled into a cruel smile, and he glanced over at the violin resting in a glass display case near the lobby, a relic from the restaurant's past, used as part of the decor. "If you want to make up for your incompetence, entertain us," he said, pointing to the instrument. "Play the violin for us. Or would you prefer to lose your job?" A shiver of fear ran down my spine, prickling my skin as if cold fingers were tracing the length of it. I hadn't touched a violin in years, not since my grandfather died. The memories of him were like old photographs, faded at the edges but vivid in their heart. He had been a street musician, his passion for music as unyielding as the weathered lines on his face. I could still see him, dressed in his worn but well-kept coat, a flat cap perched on his head, and a quiet smile on his lips as he held the violin beneath his chin. His hands, callous with the kind of roughness that comes from years of labor and playing under the open sky, would glide effortlessly over the strings, coaxing melodies that danced on the air. We would play together in the parks, for anyone who cared to listen, with the city's rhythm as our backdrop. The cobblestones beneath our feet would hum with the resonance of the notes, and the passing crowds, busy and indifferent at times, would sometimes pause to hear us. Children would stop mid-chase, eyes wide with wonder, while the elderly would tap their canes lightly to the beat. There were days when we played in the sunlight, our shadows stretching out beside us, and days when the rain misted down, but we played on regardless, our music blending with the patter of droplets on the pavement. For us, the violin was more than an instrument. It was our connection to a world that often rushed by without noticing. But after he passed, it felt as though the music had died with him. I put the violin down, letting it gather dust in the corner of my tiny flat. It wasn't just the instrument I abandoned. It was the part of myself that came alive only when I played. I buried that piece of me alongside him, telling myself that some things were better left in the past. The strings that had once felt so familiar now seemed like a language I could no longer speak, and the thought of picking up the bow again felt like trying to revive a ghost. Now I stood in front of a dining room filled with strangers, forced to face that past in the most humiliating way imaginable. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making every breath feel like a betrayal. I had no choice. My hands shook as I reached for the violin. The old would cool beneath my fingertips. The bow felt foreign in my grasp, like a piece of myself I had forgotten how to use. I drew the bow across the strings, my hands trembling, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on me. The violin felt foreign in my grip, its wood cool and smooth against my fingertips, as if it belonged to another world, a world I had abandoned long ago. I braced myself for the rough, screeching sound of an instrument too long neglected, but as the bow touched the strings, a single note floated out, pure and resonant. It echoed in the stillness like a voice emerging from the depths of memory, carrying with it a warmth I hadn't felt in years. I could almost see the vibrations ripple through the air, the notes swelling and expanding until it seemed to fill the entire room. Closing my eyes, I surrendered to the music, letting it seep into my bones and awaken something deep within me. It was as if I had reached into the darkness and pulled back a part of myself that had been asleep, forgotten, buried beneath the weight of time and circumstance. My fingers moved instinctively, gliding along the fingerboard, coaxing out notes that seemed to rise from the violin's very soul. Each sound shimmered in the air, lingering for a moment before dissolving into the next, and I could feel the instrument breathing with me, responding to my touch like an old friend rediscovered. The melody that emerged wasn't one of the grand, sophisticated compositions that Mr. Antonoff and his companions might have expected. It wasn't a well-known concerto or an intricate classical piece. Instead, it was a tune my grandfather used to play, something simple and soulful, a folk song with roots that stretched back generations. The music carried a bittersweet resonance, each note woven with longing and loss, like a lament whispered to the wind. It spoke of rainy days spent under the shelter of an old oak tree, the scent of damp earth mixing with the sound of his voice as he taught me to play, his hands guiding mine over the strings. It was a song of dust settling over a quiet park, of streets dimly lit by fading sunlight, and of love that endures even in the face of time. As I played, the notes flowed through me, unbidden and raw, as though the violin itself had a story to tell. Each stroke of the bow seemed to unravel another thread of emotion, grief, hope, joy, and resilience, all bound together in a single breath. The music became an extension of my voice, expressing what words could not. It wove a tapestry of memories, painting pictures in the minds of those who listened. A little girl on her grandfather's knee, a shared laughter, the softness of his wrinkled hands as he patted my head and told me I was a natural. The sounds rose and fell, cascading like waves, filling the room with an intensity that was almost tangible. The diners around me disappeared, their faces blurring into the background, and all that remained was the music. I was no longer just Isabella, the waitress who spilled the wine. I was a musician, a storyteller, and each note I played drew the audience deeper into a place beyond the polished tables and fine crystal, a place where art, memory, and the soul met. The restaurant was transformed, no longer just a place of luxury and fine dining. It became a place of stories. I could feel the emotions shifting in the room, sense the change in the air as the diners' chatter faded into silence. People stopped eating, their conversations falling away as the music took hold of them. I dared to glance at Mr. Antonoff, who had leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed in what seemed to be confusion, or was it fascination? With each passing note, the memories of my grandfather flowed back like a tide reclaiming the shore. I could see him in my mind's eye, as clearly as if he were standing before me. His weathered hands, rough from years of playing in the cold, gently guiding mine over the violin strings. His touch was always sure and steady, no matter how tired he was, his fingers curling around mine with a warmth that seemed to transfer directly into the music. I remembered the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a smile that would light up his entire face whenever we played together, as if the music was not just heard but lived. I recalled the tiny, crowded apartment where we used to practice, a place filled with the smell of old wood and faint tobacco smoke. The walls were lined with faded photographs and the relics of a life that stretched far beyond the humble space, each one a testament to his own journey as a musician. I could still hear the creak of the ancient wooden floor beneath our feet and see the dusty light filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room as we played. His voice would rise above the melody, not to interrupt it, but to shape it, to guide me with patient instruction or quiet encouragement. "Feel it, Isabella," he would say, his voice a blend of gravel and honey. "Let the music speak through you." And now, standing here in this opulent restaurant, with its glimmering chandeliers and polished marble floors, I felt his presence surrounding me, as if he were beside me once more. The notes weren't just escaping from the violin. They were pouring out from some deep place inside me, a place that had been closed off since he left. For the first time in years, I felt a connection to him again, to the music we shared, a bond that transcended the boundaries of time and loss. It wasn't just a performance, it was a reclamation of something precious, a piece of myself that I thought I had buried along with him. The final note hung in the air, vibrating like a delicate thread that stretched between this world and the next, quivering with a life of its own. It lingered there for a moment, filling the space with a poignant stillness, as if even the air had paused to listen. Then, as it slowly dissolved into silence, there was a shift, a rustle of movement, and something I hadn't expected: applause. At first, it was a single clap, hesitant and uncertain, coming from a nearby table. It was followed by another, and then another, the sound gathering strength as though the room itself were awakening from a spell. Within moments, the applause swelled into a wave, a standing ovation that echoed against the walls, amplifying in the high, vaulted ceiling. I stood there, breathless, with the bow still trembling in my hand, the weight of the moment pressing on me from all sides. I didn't know whether to bow or to cry. The faces in the audience blurred together, their expressions of awe and surprise merging into a sea of color and motion. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the prickling sensation behind my eyes as emotion surged through me, an overwhelming mixture of relief, pride, and a kind of grief that was bittersweet. For in that instant, as I took in the astonished looks, the applause, the pure joy that radiated from the room, I realized that I had not just found the music again. I had found myself. Mr. Antonoff's expression was inscrutable, his eyes fixed on me as though seeing me for the first time. He reached for his wallet and pulled out a stack of euros, waving it in the air. "You've earned this," he said, his voice carrying a hint of reluctant admiration. But I shook my head, refusing to take his money. I didn't play for a reward. I played for myself, for my grandfather, and for the music that had never truly left me. As I turned to walk away, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked up to see a man who had been sitting a few tables away, dressed in a dark suit with an air of understated elegance. He introduced himself as Jean-Luc Moreau, a conductor for a prominent orchestra. "Your playing, it was remarkable," he said. "Have you ever considered performing professionally?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about a career in music since my grandfather passed, and even then, it had always felt like a distant dream, too fragile to survive the reality of my life. But now, standing there with a violin still in my hand, it didn't seem quite so impossible. That night, something changed inside me. I didn't know what the future held, whether I would take up the conductor's offer or continue working as a waitress to pay the bills. But one thing was certain: the music was back. The part of me I had buried was alive again, and it was singing. I walked out of Le Beau Séjour with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I may have spilled a glass of wine, but I discovered that some accidents can lead you to exactly where you're meant to be. And as for Mr. Antonoff, I left him behind, still sitting at his table, perhaps wondering whether he had truly intended to humiliate me, or if, just maybe, he had unwittingly given me the greatest gift of all.